been some time ago.
Indeed, some time ago. How are you?
I'm doing excellent, actually. Yes, thank you. Oh,
okay, we are live.
myself?
Yeah, I have an echo.
So let's start the panel discussion on behavior of internal stakeholders in project portfolio management and its impact on success. I'd like to welcome Karen Skinner, Katrian Rangers-Fredericks, and Salman Saif. I'd like to welcome Karen Skinner. Please mute your, if you're not talking, mute your microphone. So Karen Skinner has over 20 years of experience within the life sciences industry, having held numerous senior leadership roles in clinical development, R&D operations, portfolio management, and product development. Karen currently holds the role of Head of Corporate and Portfolio Project Management at the medical research charity LifeArc, accountable for strategy development and implementation, ensuring effective governance processes, system, and resources are applied across the entire company. Katrian Rangers-Fredericks has more than 15 years of experience in clinical research in several leadership roles within the biotech, pharmaceutical, and CRO industry. As program lead, she oversaw the program strategy and execution of novel immune and CRT therapies from bench up to the market access. She perfectly understands the specific needs of biotech companies and supports startup and scale-ups with tailored program management. And Salman Saif. Salman is UCB as the Director Head of Strategic Planning and Operations in Epilepsy franchise. He has over 12 years in pharma and healthcare, driving commercial business and development strategies and strategic operation through effective strategy building, clear alignment between the strategy and operations, and ensuring excellence through end-to-end program and portfolio management. So over to you, Karen. Karen prepared a slide where she mapped interest and influence from stakeholder engagement.
Thanks very much, Peter, and it's a pleasure to be on this session this morning with Katrian, Salman, and yourself. So thank you for that introduction. So yeah, I thought it would be interesting to start with this as we talk about stakeholders, because I feel that people often make the mistake of thinking that, too much in communication, the more you communicate to your stakeholders, the better. And I think that that's simply not the case, and really you need to tailor the amount that you engage and communicate with your stakeholders. And so doing a stakeholder mapping is really good, I think, at the outset to inform that. So thinking, first of all, who are your stakeholders for your project or in your portfolio, whether that just be specific individuals on your project or teams and groups and functions that you need to consider. And then mapping them according to, first of all, the level of interest that you need them to have in your success, and that they do have. And then also the level of influence they have in helping you achieve that success. Thinking both in terms of their formal power, I suppose if they're senior management, but also their social power, so if they have the ability to influence others. And so if we take a look at the map here, I think if you look over at the top right, those are your key players. The ones at the high level of interest and the high level of influence. They're likely to be the stakeholders on your core team that are going to have a big role, I suppose, in delivering the project. So those are the ones that you really want to fully engage with all the time. You've got the greatest interest in satisfying them and making sure you really leverage those stakeholders. The ones down in the bottom left where I've labelled minimal effort, I suppose the first thing to point out here is when you're making a stakeholder map, it's probably good to keep it confidential within your team because it informs how you engage. Nobody wants to know they're in the minimal effort box, do they? But I think down in that those are the ones that you don't want to bore them with this excessive communication, because actually they do have a relatively low level of interest and a low level of influence. The ones in the top left, the keep satisfied books, I suppose those, we've lost the screen for the moment. Oh, we're back. Okay. So those are the ones, these might be the senior managers that don't have the amount of time to go into the deep dive and have that level of interest, but actually they do have a high level of influence over your project. So you want to put enough working on with them to keep them satisfied. And then over on the bottom right, the ones that you need to keep informed. Again, you need to keep those people adequately informed because they have a high level of interest, but actually don't want to overload them too much because they have a low influence on your project. So I would tend to, rather than put them into the just general 4 buckets, I would actually put them as a dot on this map and think, well, where are they now? And where do I need to move them to? Whether you want to move them up or across. And I think by doing that, then you can pull together a stakeholder plan to really inform how you need to engage with them, whether you want to keep them and maintain them where they are, or where you really need to put into effort to move them along. So I think a bit of effort at the outset and informing that engagement will pay dividends then in terms of having the stakeholders where you want them, I think, for the success of your project.
Absolutely, Karen. And I assume if you list these stakeholders, that's not only the internal stakeholders, but also the external stakeholders.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you need to be thinking about just not only the people that you need to deliver the project, but actually your stakeholders are anybody that's impacted by your project. So a lot of your external stakeholders as well, absolutely.
Mm-hmm. And so how would you then define the level of interest? I find it very important. So I think that the level of power influence, that's something you can more easily map, but the level of interest, that's not always easy to really map that. It's often like maybe a gut feeling, or what would be your recommendation here?
I think a lot of that is actually understanding your stakeholders and interviewing them. And so, and determining actually what their interest in there is in the project, and what in the deliverables in particular they're particularly interested in, so you can move them into that space.
Absolutely. Okay.
And do you use this all the time, or just in bigger projects, programs?
I tend to use it, well, as the start of each project, I would do this, but often actually there's a lot of overlap. So you might have a program in a particular area, and so all the projects underneath that, I think, would fall within this. So I would do it within a program area. But we certainly do that at the outset of a new project. And it's not just scientific projects. It would be if you're trying to make an organisational change. And it's how do we need to connect with everybody on this so that they're brought along with that change. So I would use it for a lot of activities that we would run within a pharma company, not running just a specific scientific project.
Yeah, I agree, Karen. I think it's important to do that exercise as early as possible so that you're scoping your projects well.
That's what I like about it. It's very universal for any project, and it gives you a good guide how to approach your stakeholders, how to manage them. Okay. We can go next to the next questions if you don't have anything to add. Okay, let's start with some definition context setting. The title of this panel session refers to project portfolio management. Now, both project management and portfolio management done well are vital to a company's success. But how would you define each separately? What do you view as differences between the two? Catherine, please.
Yes, okay, Peter, thank you. So I indeed see that they are listed together here. For me, that there is I think it's important to acknowledge that what's in a name, right? It's a title, so every company can have a different. It can be a different role depending on the type of company you're working in. Just to give you an example, if you work in a project in a CRO, which is very project driven, there the project manager has a really different role than in a pharma company, which is product driven. For me, the difference is portfolio management. It's more on the strategic level. It's setting the projects for me to define in the portfolio that the company has, which projects do we need or which ones do we need to create to remain competitive. So it's more about which projects, whereas for me, the project management, it's executing the projects in a good way, so that it's with the right scope, delivering the right scope, on time and within budget.
Okay, thank you. Anything to add, Salman or Karen?
Yeah, I would agree with what Catherine said, and just to take it further, I would think that portfolio, it's also beyond your project or asset or molecule as well, because it's more for future. You want to see that how you manage your risk level, for example, at portfolio, and what kind of strategies you could have. You want to do an acquisition or partnership or business development in a way. So project is more about executing, as Catherine was saying, your timelines, cost, and all those things, and there is a time horizon. But portfolio brings your how you make your choices, short, mid, and long term, and based on your circumstances or context. If you are a big pharma or a corporate part of that big pharma world, or you are more from CRO, then your choices and the decisions are dependent on those circumstances.
Yes, I agree, Salman. So I guess portfolio, it's more on long term, the long term view, and making sure that your company remains on the right strategic track.
Yeah.
And therefore, I feel from a stakeholder point of view, your approach is slightly different. I think with projects, you're talking more about day-to-day, weekly, monthly kind of level of engagement, whereas on the portfolio, which is much more strategic, that isn't changing so often in terms of, so it might be more monthly, quarterly, in terms that you would take a look at that again and engage with your stakeholders.
Yeah. Although I guess, Karen, depending on the type of company you're working in, if you work in a biotech with 100 people, you would have the same, that there would be an overlap, let's say.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, thank you. I think we could proceed to the next question. Continuing with the context setting, what are all the touch points for the project portfolio management in a pharmaceutical firm? Are they equal or varied? And what implication are they for identification of key stakeholders? Karen?
Well, building on the point that Katrine just made, it can vary so much, can't it, from a small biotech to a large pharmaceutical company. I would say in terms of your internal stakeholders, you can be thinking about, it really depends on what you're trying to deliver. So if you're in the early stage of pharmaceutics, that might be, your chemistry teams, biology teams, early preclinical. In the later stage of development, you might have, regulatory, quality, market access, marketing, all those kinds of stakeholders. And I think, often what you forget as well are the support services that you need to deliver. So your legal teams, IP teams, and of course, the project management. So I think that, those were the ones in terms of internal stakeholders. And then external stakeholders, right at the start, you need to be thinking about the end customer. Your real stakeholders are the patients, aren't they? The patients, and the physicians and the regulators and the payers. So actually thinking about how they're going to be impacted by your projects and your portfolio really determines what you do.
I would think also, and agreeing with what Karen said. So definitely there are specificities based on the environment you work on, the company, and the stage of the asset. But I do think there are certain similar themes you can build on that. So there will be a group making the strategy. So that is one interface. There is a group who is executing the strategy. That's the second interface. And there is a group who links between, or the links the both word, which is the bridging group in a way. So in any company, depending on the size or the form, you can find that a bigger group, it could be one person, it could be 10% or 20 people, it could be, you know, like all those functions that Karen said, or beyond as well. So I would think that there are differences and there are similarities in terms of the themes as well, how you approach. And then obviously there is that project versus portfolio dimension that we just talked in the beginning.
Yes, building further, Salman, I think it's important what you mentioned about that bridging function, because I think it's very project management or portfolio management. It's a key to companies to survive, to remain competitive, and especially that bridging function, because what you often see is that there is that you have the strategic disintegrated from the execution. And that's a risk for a lot of companies. It's actually should feed each other. So I like what you're saying, Salman, about that bridging group. It's a
And I like it as well what you are saying, Catherine. So this is absolutely, you know, and I'm a big fan of connecting those words, because I do think that sometimes we differentiate content and process, but you can't really build a process if you don't know the content, and you can't do much with the content if you don't have a process in a way. So it just to say your word in a different word. So really agreeing with you 100% what you said.
Okay, thank you. Next question, how do you define success for the project portfolio management? Let's start with Catherine.
Okay, so I think the talking about stakeholders, the big one of the pillars of good project or portfolio management, it's defining these stakeholders. You don't want to be in a situation where you start your program and then later on you oversaw a very key important stakeholder, and that actually turns everything, you know. So I think that's absolutely a very important factor. The other factor that I see is alluding back to, you know, what was said before, the difference or the tension between the function-driven functions and program or project delivery functions. I think it's important that these two worlds, that they speak the same language, you know, in a way. What you sometimes find is that, you know, that there is a misconnect, and that they, you know, someone of a function does not really fully understand the value of someone of project management, or the other way around, that's someone from project management is not sufficiently knowledgeable about the function. I think that's key for success.
Thank you. Karen, do you want to add anything?
Well, I would say everybody defines the success probably pretty differently on the team. You know, on a team, on a project team, it can mean different things to different people. I think within pharma, the ultimate success, I think, is getting your product on the market and making a difference to patients. So that's what we're aiming for. But I think when we work in this industry, people can work their whole careers and not actually achieve that, can't they? So you need to have to think about your successes along the way. And so I think for a project manager on a team, I think success for them is that they've ensured there's good governance, that they've ensured everybody is clear about what they're accountable for, that they're driving on their actions. And so I suppose that they're having success in their role. But I think for other people on the team, for the scientists, it might be actually, I'm finding a patent, I'm getting a publication in this journal, I'm advanced in science. And so I think it's understanding where your different stakeholders are and understanding what their different drivers are and therefore what success means for them.
If I would add briefly, agreeing what all has been said, and to build onto that, from company perspective, I would define success into two boxes. So one box would be our usual KPIs, which is your, like, have you launched your KPIs, your financials, NPVs, how many revenue you are bringing your product or drug every year for next 5 years, 10 years. And then the second box, which we see that becoming more relevant in recent years, which is on the sustainability dimension, which is getting more and more traction these days. You see Novartis CEO, very active on social media about the goals they have in the coming years. That I think it's becoming more relevant, and which is defined by how you improve the patient experience, how many patient you are able to reach, because there is a tendency to approach the Western world first, or maybe US, because of the pricing and revenue perspective, and then neglect the rest of the world or be a second wave. So there is a push that your portfolio, how successful it is to impact or reach to as many patients as possible, hence create the patient value that we all say in our pharma industry. So yeah, so I will bucket into two boxes in a way. One is more revenue driven, KPI driven, and other is more on the patient experience and patient number driven.
Thank you. We got a questions that I've been asking myself since last conference in Biopharma. Have you ever thought agile methodologies approach the project management in pharmaceutical industry, because it's different? It's a question from Julio. Thank you, Julio.
Could you repeat the question?
You can see it in the stage chat. Have you ever thought agile methodologies will approach the project management? Agile are mostly used in software development. It started there. And since then, everything becomes agile. Every company is talking about agile. And it's a different way of developing things. And
yeah, it's a good question, and I've been thinking myself a lot about this because, well, the good thing in software development, you're not constrained by all the regulatory requirements, right? I think that's in pharma a necessity. You need to be compliant with all the regulations, so you cannot just change and move. On the other hand, I do think that on maybe a more holistic level, there is a possibility to quickly learn, adapt, and maybe allowed to fail, maybe in smaller, for instance, to do smaller phase ones in a more like waterfall approach, to then, learn and adapt. So that's finally, because it's the proof of the pudding is really in the clinic, right? It's, well, in pharma, you can have a very strong preclinical package, but it's not always fully translatable to humans, at least not in oncology. And I think there you can be agile, but not in the way you would define it in software development.
Karen, what do you think of agile in pharma projects?
Well, I would say, so far, in my experience, we've not used agile in our projects, and I think largely for the reasons that Katrine has outlined. That, you know, if you're working in a heavily regulated space, then there's steps that you need to go through. But I would say what we have done is done small sprint teams, you know, where you're absolutely really focused on a core team and delivering in an area. It's certainly the intensity that you of that engagement with stakeholders in a group driving something forward, you can really accelerate the process. So we have tackled that, I think, in key areas that have been a priority for us. But in terms of applying agile methodology, yeah, we've not pursued that.
Salman, your opinion, please.
Yeah, no, thank you. I would agree what's been said, and I am the one who thinks that there is an application of agile methodology in healthcare, but obviously there is no imported solution, which means that if it's done in one way for software, it would work the same way. Not really. But there are many areas which Karen highlighted, for example, now that you can implement that. And we have seen over last 1 year that COVID also accelerated somehow the way to do things, whether we do a clinical trial. Before there were constraints like, you know, you need to have a site manager going to the sites and all those things. Now it's been done virtually, all those things very rapidly. So those kind of bits and pieces, I would think that it's already been implemented, and more it will come, because there has to be a change in pharma industry as well. You can't have a 10-year process to launch a drug, so it has to be done sooner in one way or the other, within the given constraints of the regulatory and clinical and others that we all know.
Yes, and I think also in protocol design, they are already, again, my field is more, I come from oncology more, they are already agile designs possible.
Thank you. What I've noticed is that the projects that are in pharma industry are much more longer, and there are too many stakeholders and too many regulators. So this is maybe why it's hard to implement agile methods. And from my experience, agile is done within the 2 weeks of sprint, and it can happen that you never reach the goal. One of my friends, agile coach, told me that when you imagine a project like usual, when you have when you do it the old way, the waterfall method, you set the goal to yourself to go from Vienna to Paris, and to go there in 6 months, or to go there. Then you can have a plane, which is the old method, and you just go onto the plane. You have to have a ticket, and you get there. But when you do agile, you do sprints every 2 weeks. It's like going by car. Then you sit in the car, you drive somewhere, and it might be that the business changes its goal, and you never end up in Paris, and you go to Venice, for example. So this is my point of view to that. Thank you. We've reached the time. Is there any questions in the audience? Any other questions? Okay. Thank you for the participation. Thank you for the great questions. And the following is a case study on building high-performing project teams. So thank you, Karen. Thank you, Catherine and Salman. We're going to the next case study.
Okay, bye.
Bye.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.
Have a nice day.